Welcome to Lucid Horizon. This is a show in which we talk about technology, science, humanity, and politics. In this episode, we have a treat for you. We have Mr. Laban Coblintz, the Director of Communication of ITER project. It's an amazing project. It's an amazing science, engineering, and technology project, which is, I think, meant to change the course of history of energy production on this planet. And I will let Mr. Coblintz tell you the details of our story today. And with that, I bring you Mr. Coblintz. Thank you very much, Laban, for accepting our invitation, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alayar. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right off bat, could you tell us what is ITER and what are the significance of ITER as a mean of introduction?
Sure, thank you. I will start with the word ITER, because in the original conception of this word some decades ago, the title of the experiment was International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. That's how you got the acronym. And that goes back all the way to shortly after a 1985 agreement between Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, when they were trying to do something about reducing their nuclear weapons arsenals and really starting that East-West dialogue. And they wanted to do something positive, and this project was conceived. But over time, the word has changed because, and we no longer use that spelled out acronym, although you will see it, journalists use it from time to time, because of the word thermonuclear and the confusion that sometimes exists between fission nuclear and military nuclear, meaning atomic bombs, and hydrogen fusion, which is also a nuclear reaction, but somewhat different. We'll get into all of that, but more recently, we have stuck with the Latin meaning for ITER, which is the way. And we like to think of ITER as the way in the sense of being a model for international collaboration. The project is a convergence by 35 countries to build the largest hydrogen fusion device ever made as an experimental device to study and to study physics phenomenon that we have not been able to do so far, that will pave the way for the fusion commercial machines that follow. So it is actually the first ever. There have been hundreds of tokamaks built, but it is the first industrial scale fusion device.
Thank you very much for that very simple and comprehensive introduction. So ITER is not a new power plant, but a scientific experiment that, if successful, could prove the viability of fusion as a clean energy source. Could you tell us what is the difference between fission and fusion, and why fission is so much better than fusion?
Sure. I know you have quite an educated audience. I don't need to go too deeply into the physics to explain this, but in their simplest version, fission and fusion are two natural phenomenon that each are illustrations of Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, in which a tiny bit of matter is converted into a large amount of energy. All of the existing nuclear power plants in the world, more than 400, are fission plants. So let me first talk about the difference in what happens in fission and fusion. In a fission plant, normal size, same size as say 1,000 megawatt, one gigawatt energy electricity generation plant, you have several hundred tons of a very heavy substance like uranium, most often, or plutonium, or a mix, in which, and the reaction consists of a neutron hitting at a certain speed, hitting that heavy nucleus like uranium and splitting it. And in that split, you produce daughter products, but you also produce a certain amount of a burst of neutrons, additional neutrons that are quote, quote, fast, meaning that they are highly energetic. And the energy, the energy is more, the mass is slightly reduced in the sum of these daughter products, and the energy is slightly higher. That's E equals mc squared. So a little more about fission. Fission then is a chain reaction. Those neutrons that are produced in fission give their excess energy as heat to water, which produces steam, which will drive turbines and produce electricity. But as those neutrons slow down, they create more fission. So in other words, they bombard another uranium nucleus, so you have a chain reaction. That's a really critical thing to understand about fission, because if I start to compare the differences between fission and fusion, one of them has to do with safety, both as it is real and as it is perceived. So the fission reaction, being a chain reaction, means that the operator has to maintain a certain degree of quote, quote, poisons to slow it down, or additional input to speed it up, so that will remain, that chain reaction will remain at a point that's called critical. If it's subcritical, you're not going to get electricity. If it's supercritical, you end up with what could be a runaway reaction, which has got to be cooled very, very rapidly, or it could lead to a meltdown, an accident like at Chernobyl or Fukushima or 3 Mile Island. So how is that all different from fusion? Remember that I said it's still E equals mc squared, but in fusion, you take the very, very lightest element, hydrogen, two isotopes, two variants of hydrogen. One of them, in a normal hydrogen nucleus, you have just a proton, and in deuterium, you add 1 neutron. In tritium, still hydrogen, but you add 2 neutrons. So in fusion, you're not splitting anything, you're colliding it. You collide a deuterium and a tritium nucleus together at very, very high speeds, because now they're both positively charged. If you have an ionized nucleus separated from its electron, you have 2 positively charged particles that normally would not be able to join. So they have to be done at very, very, very high speeds. Now, in the sun and in all the stars, fusion occurs because of gravitation, because of the density at the center of these big balls of hydrogen. So that's what the sun is. And in fact, fusion is the most common form of energy in the universe. It's why we're here today. It is why we are alive. It is the source of all light and heat on Earth. It is what makes our Earth habitable. So the fusion occurring at the heart of the star is using hydrogen that is so dense. It's the magnitude, the weight, the mass of the sun is about 300,000 times that of Earth. So the hydrogen at the core of the sun is about 70 times the density of normal steel. So these hydrogen, deuterium, tritium, these nuclei are pressed together very, very hard. That's how they work. We can't do that on Earth. So fusion on Earth, getting back to the reactor, something that we generally call a tokamak. A tokamak is a word, a Russian word that stands for toroidal shape, like a donut, magnetic coils. And with magnetic confinement fusion in a tokamak, we actually only have 2 to 3 grams of fuel. Remember I said fission had 200 to 300 tons of fuel, right? So several 100,000 kilos. In the fusion tokamak, you only have 2 to 3 grams. And as these nuclei collide, the same thing in a certain way happens in the sense of E equals mc squared, because a tiny portion of that incoming 2 forms of hydrogen, that incoming mass, is converted to energy. But actually the fusion reaction is about 4 times more energetic than the fission reaction. So the neutron is again, 1 neutron comes off of this reaction, and the rest of it combines to make a non-radioactive helium nucleus. The helium nucleus, well, the incoming deuterium and tritium have an energy of about 0.7 mega electron volts. For those of you who understand those engineering terms, the outgoing helium nucleus has an energy of about 3.5 mega electron volts. So it's 5 times more energetic than the incoming, and the neutron coming away is over 14 mega electron volts. So that means 20 times more powerful. That's the energy translated from the slight loss of mass. And that, to put it in metaphoric terms, that neutron is so fast that if released in free space, it would reach the moon in about 8 or 9 seconds. So that neutron will impact the metal wall of the tokamak and translate its kinetic energy like a bullet hitting a steel wall. It will translate, if you felt that afterward, the bullet would stop, but the wall would be very hot. So the neutron transfers its kinetic energy as heat, and the water circulating behind the wall then is heated up and will, of course, go on to make just like with a fission plant, or for that matter, an oil or gas electricity plant, it will go on to make steam to make electricity, to drive a turbine and make electricity. Now, back to this fission fusion comparison. Remember everything I said about fission. Those the split when something is no longer uranium, but is something like xenon or krypton or other things as it decays, that eventually becomes waste. Unless you decide you're going to reuse, that eventually translates into waste. And that waste becomes a tens of thousands of year legacy. It needs to be monitored because it is highly radioactive and very long lived. The decay of that waste takes many years. With fusion, you do not have that equivalent. Your products are non-radioactive helium, not hazardous in any way, although it will continue to heat the plasma. We'll talk about that. And the neutron. And so in effect, what we make from that, we put lithium in the walls of the tokamak so that those neutrons not only transfer heat, but will also make tritium. So they're actually creating our fuel, sending more fuel in. So the waste from fusion will be both tritium, which in fact we will maintain the tritium system as leak tight as possible because we want to reuse that as fuel. It's not waste, it's just more fuel. But you will have some waste that will, where the tritiated materials, for example, or the materials that become radioactive in the actual metal of the tokamak will become radioactive because it's bombarded with neutrons. So from that standpoint, sure, you will have waste, a much smaller amount of waste from a fusion plant, but it is all relatively short-lived. So first of all, it's much less in volume. Secondly, if you left a tokamak simply stay in place for 100 years, you could recycle the metal because it would no longer be radioactive. It would no longer be lethal. So waste is a big contrast. The reaction itself is a big contrast. If I simply unplug the device somehow, it shuts down. There is no buildup. There's no chain reaction in fusion. And so there's no buildup of what fission people call decay heat, which must be removed by cooling water or another coolant, or else in a fission reactor, you will get the meltdown. You cannot create a nuclear accident in the Chernobyl, Fukushima style, a meltdown accident. You cannot do that with a fusion plant. You could conceivably have distortion of the shape of the magnetic field, and you could hurt the machine itself in minor or major ways. But that would not result in a radioactive release. It would not result in a meltdown. So I've talked about those two advantages. The other advantage is that the fuel for fusion is really in water. That's the deuterium can be extracted directly from water. And you can also extract the secondary fuel, which is lithium, which then will breed tritium. And lithium is abundant in the Earth's core. So in addition to all of that, your fuel costs are very, very low from fusion. So advantages over fission, similar reaction, but safe. I would argue more economic. We can get to that later. Abundance of fuel, virtually unlimited supply for really hundreds of millions of years. And the economics, I think, are much better and without the waste problem. So that's a very long answer, but that illustrates your differences between fission and fusion.
Those are very important points and very important distinctions between fusion and fission. But we know that there's been many efforts in the last 7 years since we knew about fusion, and the fusion science has been hot in the last 7 years. As you said, the name tokamak is actually a Russian word that was developed back in the 1950s and 60s when the Russians started working on the fusion reactors. But along all this time, we have not been very successful so far as what makes the difference in between the fission and fusion. We knew that the distinction, but we weren't actually able to make a reactor that will establish as a model for the future commercial power plants. I know that your plant is not a power plant, but what makes ITER different from the past attempt?
Sure. To be honest, the biggest thing is size. When you look at the implications of size for a tokamak, it's quite profound. There is a comic strip that also became a movie called Iron Man, in which Iron Man puts a tokamak in his chest. That is his power. I don't know if you've ever heard that. But to be honest, that's not realistic, because you need a certain size in order for a tokamak to be effective. The primary measurement parameter of a nuclear fusion, a hydrogen fusion plant, which is also embedded in the ITER mission, relates to a single letter called Q. Q is the ratio in plasma physics of the output heating, the output thermal power that you will get from the plasma, with the denominator being the input thermal power needed to heat the plasma. So at ITER, we can express our entire mission in an equation, Q greater than or equal to 10. So that means that in our plasma pulses, we want to get 500 megawatts or more of thermal power out for about 50 megawatts of heating in. And we will have a capacity to raise that heating input and a capacity to do a higher output, but that's our pulsed power goal. To get to that, all of the other tokamaks that you referenced, there has never been even a Q of 1. In other words, which sounds very dispiriting, we have never been able to get more energy out than in. But what we do have is all of the data showing that the larger you make the tokamak, the volume of the vacuum vessel that houses the fusion plasma, the larger you make it, the greater the curve goes. Now, there are actually three factors. One is the strength of the magnetic field, which in ITER will get to 12 in the very center of the central solenoid, that the central magnet, about 13 Tesla. But ultimately, you're going to be putting a field of 11 to 12 Tesla, which for those of you who are not familiar, that's 380,000 times the Tesla of the Earth's magnetic field, if that gives you so it's a very concentrated magnetic field. So the field strength of the Tesla, the density, the plasma density, and the size, the actual volume, are directly influencing. Those are the three things that influence Q. So the largest tokamak to date, which was a European tokamak built by Eurofusion, it's called the Joint European Torus. It's next to Oxford, near the town of Colham in England. JET, for an input heating power of 23 megawatts of heat, it produced a 16 megawatt output. So really about 0.67. That was its Q. ITER will have as its goal both that greater than or equal to 10, as well as it will need to, we have the goal of averaging the pulses so that we get to a more or less steady state, so that from the actual heating that you're feeling in the walls and in the heating cooling systems, you will be feeling a relatively steady state that corresponds to a Q of 5. Now, we could have made that much larger. The reason we make it the size that we do is that we are trying to get to a phenomenon called a burning plasma. And a burning plasma means that you can think of it as a self-heating or largely self-heating plasma. What it means is that the neutrons coming off and specifically the helium atom or the helium molecule nucleus that I said will come off of the fusion reaction at 5 times the energy of the incoming particles. when you get that helium nucleus will go on to continue to heat the plasma. It's transferring its heat until it just loses its heat and it drops down to the bottom of the reactor, of the tokamak. So the result is, as that helium is continuing to heat the plasma, when you get to the point that more than 50% of your heat is coming actually from the fusion reaction itself, rather than from external heating systems, cyclotrons and gyrotrons and so forth. So instead of that, it's coming now from the fusion reaction itself. When you get to more than 50% self-heating, that's what we call a burning plasma. And you can get to a higher point called ignition, at which you don't need to do anything more than just continue to feed fuel. So we know about burning plasmas, but a plasma physicist's ability to study that is at the distance of the center of the sun, or in the microsecond from an H-bomb. So nobody has ever been able to do a useful study of a burning plasma. And in order to shape the commercial machines that follow, ITER is built to a size where it will both demonstrate the industrial scale feasibility of fusion for peaceful purposes, and it will also allow scientists from all over the world to study the burning plasma phenomenon and then to optimize subsequent machines based on their results.
So I understand that burning plasma, as its core, has a temperature of 150 to 300 million degrees centigrade, and so this is an amazing capability of being able to produce 150 million degrees of centigrade. I mean, that's a huge temperature. The temperature that doesn't allow any object, any element, any alloy, any metal on Earth to stay solid, and it will melt anything. But still, this marvel of technology and engineering that you have achieved in ITER, you've been able to isolate that core temperature from the vessel walls using magnetic fields, obviously using very strong magnetic fields, to achieve this amazing capability, and basically separating the heat from the core that is really an unmanageable temperature. You've been able to manage that amazing temperature. And you mentioned in passing that ITER has brought some 35 countries to participate in this very impressive international partnership. Given that there has never been such partnership between countries like the US, China, Russia, the EU, India, Japan, South Korea, and other countries who are participating, to demonstrate the feasibility of a scientific principle that could lead in the development of a commercial product. What aspect of ITER has been so attractive to these very different countries to encourage them to chip in financially and scientifically with their resources to build a fusion reactor?
It's a great question, thank you. And the short answer that some would give is that at least at its start, none of these countries, not even the massive power, the industrial power of the United States, or the futuristic work that Russia has done, or others, none of them probably could have done this on their own. But there's a better answer to that. Every country that is involved in ITER, so all of the European Union, including because the European Union has its membership in ITER through Euratom, and so Switzerland and the UK have their membership also through Euratom. Actually, following Brexit, the UK is still finalizing its agreement to get back into Euratom, but we have continued to have the UK folks helping here on the site. So the Europe, and then China, India, Japan, South Korea, Russia, and the United States are all members. Each of those countries, to a more or less defined extent, has its own vision, its own fusion roadmap. But for each country to make an industrial scale device that was not going to produce electricity, but was actually going to be used as an experimental facility, was not a practical situation. ITER is expensive enough to do. That's one part of it. But the other part is also, if you look at who is actually doing the work here, you have the top companies from all over. You've got China with their giant consortium of ASIP and SWIP. You have companies like General Atomics in the US. Actually, you have, I think, 600 contracts in the US in 44 states plus the District of Columbia. In Korea, it's Hyundai Heavy Engineering. In India, it will be companies like Larsen and Toubro or Tata. In Japan, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. You have these top, Rosatom in Russia. You have these top companies and organizations, technical powerhouses that are all doing pieces, partly because they all want their companies to have the advanced technology that goes into ITER, but partly because the engineering challenges are severe. Alayar, you were mentioning very rightly the temperature of the plasma. I mean, we have had before in smaller tokamaks, to be fair, we have had the ability to get up to those temperatures, even higher temperatures. Not that that is necessarily necessary, that is really necessary, because for the approximate temperature at which, at a subparticle level, temperature equates to velocity. So what you're looking for is a velocity at which these particles will overcome their repulsion and combine and fuse and produce the fusion reaction. So that velocity translates loosely to about 150 million degrees Celsius, but you'll have some variation in that because obviously you're heating the overall volume, which in jet, as what I had mentioned before, the previous largest one was about 80 cubic meters, whereas in ITER the plasma volume is more than 800 cubic meters. So a large volume, and you're also very, very correct. We need to confine that. We need to create, with a series of magnetic systems, we need to create a magnetic field that is precisely attuned to the shape of the tokamak. So inside the metal of the walls, you have a precisely configured invisible magnetic field that is in fact holding the charged particles, the deuterium and tritium nuclei in the ionized plasma, as well as the electrons, away from the walls, but allows the non-charged, the neutrons with no charge, which means that they will escape the magnetic field. It allows them to exit and transfer their energy. So the engineering feats are, one might say, not just amazing, but almost insane, because the superconductor material, in order to get that incredibly high Tesla strength, the superconducting material that we are using is niobium tin, niobium titanium, which means that has to be, in order to be superconducting, meaning that in the customary electrical equation, the ohms, the resistance, is reduced to zero. An electron can flow completely freely through those magnets, through those materials. To do that, it's a superconductor that has to be cooled to minus 269 degrees, about 4 Kelvin, 4 degrees above absolute zero. So you've got, at a certain point here in this tokamak, you've got in the central magnet, in these magnets, in these circular magnets, you've got a temperature that is of the order of interstellar space, that cold. And just a few meters away, you've got the plasma at 150 million degrees, one of the hottest points in the universe. So that says that the better answer to why did all of these countries agree to come together and build ITER as a single unit was not only because arguably no one country could do that on its own at the start, but also because it was a convergence of all of these countries' roadmaps. Every country roadmap leads through ITER to the commercial machines that will follow. And their sense of urgency, their energy needs, their engineering and scientific preferences may lead to divergent pathways afterward. But in that way, all roads go through ITER.
That's remarkable. Those numbers are very impressive. So we know that the temperature at the center of the sun is very close to the temperature of the plasma burning core of the tokamak reactors, 150 million degrees centigrade. And you bring the 150 million degrees centigrade to right next to it, you have a device, a superconducting magnet that's operating at the temperature of the interstellar space, which is the coolest temperature in the universe. You know, even the universe has not been able to do this, because in the universe we have stars where the temperature is very high, millions of degrees of centigrade at the core, but you don't have interstellar temperature immediately a meter or 10 meters or 20 meters away from the core, from these 150. In other words, actually, if you look at the temperature on Earth, which is hundreds of millions of kilometers away from the sun, the temperature on Earth sometimes can get up to very uncomfortably high temperatures. So, it's, you know, and in order to really, around the stars, to get to interstellar temperature, you have to really get very, very far from the stars in order to go to from 150 million to 4 degree Kelvin, which is the boiling temperature of the liquid helium required for the superconducting magnets. That is really a marvel of engineering and technology, and I'm so delighted to see that, you know, 35 countries have come together to do this. But we know that it's not really made to make electricity. It's not, in other words, it's not a power plant, but it's actually a research device. So what can it do that justifies the enormity of effort in terms of cost, human resources, and international priority that it has received from participating countries, which are otherwise, you know, these countries, the one that you named, these 35 countries, are usually in a fierce economic, military, and ideological competition, but now they've come together on this particular project that is not even a power plant, it's actually a research lab. So what are they hoping to get out of that? I mean, I know you kind of touched upon that, but can you elaborate a little bit more? What's in it for China? What's in it for Russia? And, you know, I can understand the US and the Europeans and the other allies, but really there is enough science and engineering and gain to be made from this project that, you know, people with diametrically opposite ideological colors have come together to do this.
Yeah, you know, it's such a great question, and I feel that the best answer that I could give you is almost an emotional one. What do they hope to gain? They hope to gain peace. Now that may be a radical statement, but let me explain what I mean. We have other challenges. We have just gone through the pandemic of COVID-19. We have at times trade wars, yes, ideological differences, even military conflicts. We have certainly illustrated financial differences and transactions, and even insecurities that occur with cybersecurity in our now very, very digital world. We also are facing the specter of climate change. And I would argue that one thing that all of these countries are hoping to gain from ITER is a demonstration that for these kinds of challenges that transcend borders, that regardless of ideology, my failure will affect your safety and security and human security as well. These approaches are all threats that we must find a way to collaborate in order to achieve our own survival as a species, arguably. And so I would say that there is a vision, and I have colleagues from all of those countries who work with me here, and I am able to say in that way that, and I can guarantee you it is a shared vision, that ITER as the way will also serve as a model for how we can set aside our differences enough to collaborate on issues that will affect not just me, but the legacy that I give to my daughter as an inheritance, and that we give to many generations who will follow. There's something hilariously different about fusion. And I love it because it's the name also. Fusion would imply coming together.
That's right.
In the 1950s, you referred to this history earlier. There was a lonely, many people at that, well, so let's go even further back. If you go back 100 years, there are French and German scientists who were coming up with the idea, and English scientists coming up with the idea of how fusion operated at the core of the sun and the stars back as far as 1919, 1920. We're at about the 100th anniversary. But practical ways of illustrating that were actually going in many, many different directions in different countries. And there was a Soviet soldier stationed by himself on Sakhalin Island who was a physics nut, and he had nothing but textbooks. He didn't have formal education in physics. And he came up with the idea of this toroidal shape in which the velocity could be taken, of the particles could be taken to such an extent that they would collide and fuse. Now, he was looking not at magnetized confinement, but static confinement. But bar that, he's the one that came up with that shape, and he sent it to Stalin. And of course, Stalin had no idea what to do with it, but he gave it to his, Sakharov and his top scientists, and they came up with this idea of this might actually be feasible, and they worked on it, and they worked more, and they got to a point where now we're talking about 1958, the end of the 50s, where they presented a paper that is still remarkable to me, because they didn't present it. They presented it to their Cold War enemies. By this time, we're talking about Khrushchev going with Kurchatov. That Igor Kurchatov was the scientist, and when it presented a paper that by all means should have been confidential in every way, because every human endeavor we have done since we were in caves was, if we made a technological advance, our first question is, how can I help myself? How can I help my family, my clan, my allies, my country? And they went and shared it. So they shared this information. And of course, the British and later the Americans hearing about it, deeply skeptical. Why would they even share this? But at the margins of these Geneva conferences for peace, this started to be a topic. Of course, scientific diplomacy, scientists discussing the possibilities. And roughly 10 years later, they presented another paper, this time at a conference in still the Soviet Union, at which T1, Tokamak 1, had been followed by Tokamak 2 and Tokamak 3. And in T3, they had achieved 10 million degrees. Nobody had ever gotten close to that. Nobody had ever been close to representing that escalation that said, if we keep going in this direction and make it better and better, we will get to that temperature necessary for fusion. So at that stage, the Russians actually said to the British, you're better at measurement. Why don't you come back with your measuring instruments to our laboratory and verify our conclusions? And that was the beginning of international collaboration. And you could look at many other tokamaks. You could look at D3D in San Diego. You can look at the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, PPPL. You can look at the Stellarator, a twisted version of a tokamak, in Wendelstein 7X in Germany, or K-Star in Korea, or some that you're hearing about, East in China, West, just a kilometer or two from me here in France. You can look at many of these. And what you will find is that almost without exception, they are populated by international scientists, and they are sharing the information. So fusion has this strange brainchild that says, we want to collaborate. And part of it, in fairness, is because it's really hard. Part of it, if you ask, coming back to your question, what do they all hope to gain from ITER? The idealistic answer, which I've given, is collaboration. But the hard as nails truth answer is also, because we are going to gain from this the engineering demonstration. So of course we want to build the experimental device, but right now, all of the intellectual property coming out that says, how do you build a magnet that is 17 meters in its longest dimension, and it needs to be super cool dimension, needs to be superconducting to make the magnetic field. How do I make that in a way that it will have a precision in the range of millimeters, sometimes under a millimeter? Why? Because the magnetic field that we described has to be very, very tightly woven, like the weave of your jacket. It has to be so tight that a proton, a charged proton, cannot escape that field. Because otherwise, if you don't have an efficiently woven magnetic field, not only will you bombard the steel walls with these particles, in addition, you won't get to the fusion reaction because you have to contain and shape and mold that plasma in order to get to this magic Q that you want to get to, this much higher output than input. So that's a long answer to your question again.
Well, that's a very important answer. And, you know, as you talk, I mean, I get so excited about every sentence that comes out of your mouth that, you know, although you're giving me very good answers, but, you know, that raises many more questions. But, you know, I'm trying to contain my enthusiasm and keep ourselves within the jurisdiction of the 2 hour that I asked you to commit to this interview. And, you know, you made a reference to this Q factor or the gain factor. And that's a number that, you know, characterizes the performance of the power plants, which, as you explained, is the ratio of the output power to the input power. Actually, this Q number or the gain factor is something that engineers use for the output of engines that they design in car engines. And ITER, and you mentioned that ITER has a gain factor of 10, which is, I mean, you're hoping that it should have a gain factor of 10 because no tokamak has ever been able to produce a gain factor like that. How does that compare with other modes? I mean, I know you compared it with other tokamak reactors in the past, but how does that gain factor compares to other modes of power generation like hydroelectrics and gas turbine and nuclear fission to which you referred? And what is the limit of power generation by a single fission reactor? Is there a limit, or is 10 the limit? Could we possibly one day generate the power required by a small country of, let's say, 10 million, the size of Sweden or Israel, by a single fission power plant?
The simple answer is yes. Size theoretically is unlimited. It's limited by engineering. It's not limited by the science. So as long as you can build it, it will function. Now, you know, when I say that, let me get back to your comparison issues. You know, the efficiencies that we get out of a tremendous engine, the best engines, and they're married, you know, ranging from the internal combustion engine to turbos and many other kinds of things that we use, or a jet engine. You know, those efficiencies are measured always in gains that are much smaller. I'll give you an example. 1 gram of a fusion fuel, the combined deuterium-tritium, is roughly the equivalent of 10,000 tons of coal. So 10 million kilos, right? So that then, if you start to go even further to renewable energy, solar energy, we hear quite a lot these days about solar plants and how solar and wind are becoming cheaper and cheaper, and arguably in some journals you will read they are the cheapest form of electricity. It's not my business at all to trash renewables. I am an enormous fan of renewable energy, and I think that in the perfect world of the future, when you're asking how could we power a country or a city or other things, you would be envisioning a combination. My perfect vision would be a combination of renewables and fusion. Why? Because both are essentially powered by either the natural processes, indirectly powered by the sun, which is also fusion, or you're talking about a highly concentrated energy. But it is really important to be realistic about renewables. And the simplest comparison is that they are using fusion energy at a distance, as you said, hundreds of millions of kilometers from the sun. So that means that they are extraordinarily diffuse. And I believe, you hear that critics of renewables complain about the intermittency, the storage capacity that they require, et cetera. But at their heart, they're just not concentrated. So the reason that we have been addicted to petroleum fuels for so long is both because they represent a battery. In other words, they represent the accumulated energy of dead plants and organic matter that has been compressed and compressed and compressed over millennia. So we are taking essentially that stored energy like a battery, originally driven from the sun. Those plants, that life got compressed, and we are taking that out. But it's so versatile. You can burn petroleum in a lamp, in a kerosene lamp. You can burn petroleum in your car. You can put it into something very, very tiny. You can put it into something very macro. So petroleum's got this unbelievable versatility. And if we're going to replace it, if we're going to save the world not only from the pollution, but the climate change caused by taking petroleum waste and deliberately for 150 years doing what we would never do with nuclear waste, nuclear fission waste. Nuclear fission waste terrifies us. We want to put it in, vitrified cylinders and store it in underground caverns for, tens of thousands of years. But the petroleum waste, we see it coming out of our exhaust, but then we filter it and we don't see it, and we're just discharging that directly into the atmosphere. So great things about petroleum. It has served us very well. It has driven the last 150 years of the Industrial Revolution. It's powered our lifestyles. It's why we've got iPhones and the ability to hold this interview remotely. But that said, we know we desperately need a clean energy source. So that will mean that we will get to a combination of, I believe, renewables for those countries that accept fission, and it's got these public acceptance issues and so forth. But for those countries that accept fission, France, where I live, is one. 70-something% of our electricity in France is absolutely clean. We can easily start to achieve our clean climate goals. Why? Because we're using fission, and fission releases no carbon into the atmosphere. However, because of the safety and waste concerns, many countries don't want to accept it. So maybe that will end up being a bridge. But fusion would be able to be built, I said as large as you want. My recommendation, if you take a country of, you said, I think, a country, for example, a country of, say, 10 million inhabitants, or even smaller, because this is easier to illustrate. If you take a city like Washington, D.C., or a country that has a similar number, about 6 million people in Metro D.C., you would normally need something on the order of 6 gigawatts of electricity at our current consumption rates. Now, there's a trick in that. I'm going to come back to that later. But at current consumption rates of electricity across the U.S., you'd need about 3 plants, each at about 3 fusion plants, each at about 2 gigawatts, right? So if you made the power output about 2,500 and the plant itself used about 500, you would have a net gain of about 2,000. And yes, the Q factor with greater volume or greater strength of magnetic field can be much, much higher. And so colleagues at Massachusetts Institute of Technology or in the UK, a company called Tokamak Energy, they're working on fusion reactors that will try to scale up the ability for, quote, high temperature superconductors, which will give you, they're yttrium based. They're a compound that's more like a tape than a coil, but doesn't matter. They if they're successful at scaling up, which there's no reason to think they will not be, you will be able to get even a greater, maybe double the magnetic field strength. And then you'll have to figure out the material science for the bombardment of the walls to be even stronger than what we would get at ITER with the field strength. But getting back to DC, rather than building one 6 gigawatt, 6,000 megawatt fusion plant, you would want to do several. Why? Because depending on what grid you're going to connect to, you will have periods of outage. So fusion will run continuously as a fossil fuel plant or a fission plant will run. But you talk about some periods of downtime for maintenance where you have to change out components. There's no need to refuel like with a fission plant, but you will be taking the helium, accumulated helium, what we call ash. It doesn't look like ash, but it's the helium after it's lost its energy. You'll need to take that out of the base of the tokamak and put empty cartridges in there. So there is maintenance, and it will be robotic, so it will be efficient, but the operational time, I would venture to say, would probably be in the 90 to 95% time. But you do not want to have in that period a shutdown of all of your country or all of your cities electrical power. So you would stagger that as we do it now with multiple plants online. But that's about how much you would need for a country of that sort.
So I hear that from the engineering and feasibility point of view, it's possible, but from practical point of view of the convenience and the possibility of the security, safety, and the possibility of interruption and disruption to the service, it's better to build it in the form of multiple
several smaller
plants. That's right.
I would make a caveat though, so that I should have finished one other point. In the US right now, electricity makes up in the range of 25% of our primary energy consumption, right? So when you hear people say that 10% of US energy is coming from renewables, that's actually not accurate. It's 10% of electricity. And if electricity is 25% of overall power supply or overall energy consumption, then renewables are about 2.5% of the overall consumption. So what is the other consumption? That includes much of your transportation. If you decide that Biden's mandate of setting, by such and such date, we have to have all electrical vehicles, then that means that you will need more electricity, because right now we're fueling that with petroleum, right? So the more that you use end use as electricity, the more you will need. What about our tankers? What about our military, our ships? What about all of the transport vehicles, both planes and these giant ocean-bearing vessels that bring our much coveted goods from wherever they're manufactured around the world? Those also are nearly 100% powered by petroleum. So if you're going to replace that, it probably won't be electricity. It will probably be hydrogen fuel cells. So now you've gotten even more inefficient, because hydrogen, although it's touted as a green fuel, hydrogen is not a fuel. It does not exist raw in nature. It exists in combination, such as in H2O in water. So if you use the most common method, you will use electrolysis to split the water, make hydrogen. But the electrolysis means you use electricity, which means you had to have a primary fuel, whether that's renewables or coal or oil or fusion. So if you're now going to make a hydrogen fuel cell to run the tanker that brings your goods from China, or to run the vessel that brings your goods from China, then that means that you have to consider the efficiency of an original source of electricity that is used in electrolysis to produce the splitting that gives you the hydrogen fuel. And now you're going to take that hydrogen fuel and use it in a fuel cell. So you've lost some degree of efficiency with all of that. So if we now say that we're going to replace the 75% of primary US energy consumption that is not now electricity, but it's maybe oil heating, it's agriculture, it's transportation, it's all these other uses. And right now we're using oil or gasoline or whatever because it's so easy and handy and efficient. So if we start to do that, we will need to make much, much more electricity. So we come back to our illustration of Washington, D.C., then it may be that you don't need the current amount, which is 6 gigawatts of electricity supply. Take that, maybe that now is 24 gigawatts, or maybe because of its inefficiency, it's even more than that you need, that we need all of this electricity to power. And if you get up to 24 gigawatts, then yes, maybe the size of your fusion plants would be 6 gigawatts each, right? So all of those factors will go into determining the most practical answer to your question in our clean fusion powered future.
That's remarkable. Actually, you kind of use the word splitting both in the case of electrolysis and in the case of fission. And I just want to make it clear to our audience that you're referring to, when you're talking about fission, you're talking about splitting of the nucleus. And when you're talking about electrolysis, you're talking about the chemical process that's separation of hydrogen and oxygen. That can happen at much lower cost than nuclear case, the nuclear splitting. And one point that came to my mind when we were talking about the motivations of these various countries for coming together on this particular project is because it seems to me, Laban, that fusion doesn't lend itself to miniaturization, but fission does, and converting nuclear energy, fission or fusion, into illicit purposes like nuclear weapons, one of the main requirements of miniaturization, because you need to deliver this thing to somewhere else. You don't want it to explode where you're launching it, right? So there is, as I understand it, the bigger these tokamak reactors are, the bigger energy they produce, which means they're going exactly in the opposite to the direction of miniaturization. And they, at least as they stand, as the science and engineering and technology stands, it doesn't really lend itself to miniaturization. So it's safe to say that it will not, for a long time, it will never be used for military purposes or for anything but peaceful energy production purposes, which is remarkable that, there's a technology that inherently is good and there is nothing evil about it. And even that really is so advantageous about this particular technology. In earlier you referred to the European, the joint European thermonuclear experiment of JET, which, if I remember correctly, it was built in 1983, and with half the power generation capability of ITER. And the main purpose of building it was to be used as a test bed for the development of ITER. For example, the jet plasma vessel walls are made of beryllium and tungsten, as will be the case for ITER. And please correct me if I'm wrong. Could you tell us a bit about JET and how it really helped for the science and engineering technology that eventually justified ITER?
Sure. I am not in any sense an expert on JET. I have a lot of colleagues at ITER that came from there. And yet what I would say, first of all, the size is different, but the thing that JET did was demonstrated, for one thing, the feasibility of, for example, these beryllium walls to breed tritium, the tungsten as a material that would work as in its ability to withstand extreme heat, because as I mentioned, even though you've got this magnetic field holding things away from the walls, this helium ash over time decays. So at the very, very bottom of ITER, you have this, at the bottom of the tokamak, you have this thing called a diverter. A diverter just means that's where the quote, quote, gravity settling ash diverts to and is collected. So they're little modules that will be able to be taken out robotically and exchanged. JET demonstrated this. It demonstrated the efficacy of some of the materials. It also demonstrated that deuterium-tritium fusion worked at a scale that was higher than anything else had ever been attempted. So that allowed you to take all of your computer simulations and your calculations that had been done on many, plotted tokamak by tokamak to watch the graph of efficiency get higher and higher. It demonstrated conclusively the continuation of that efficiency gain. So even though it didn't break even, it showed that the graph and the calculations and everything else were correct. That's very important. It also produced a tremendous amount of the design expertise, the manufacturing expertise, et cetera, that led to ITER. So it's very easy for scientists to focus on ITER as their plaything. This is going to be this largest experimental device ever in the history of humans, and that's true. But it is also in this engineering phase where we are demonstrating, as I said earlier, that you can make these giant components at the necessary levels of precision. And had we not had JET, it would have been more difficult because it's bigger than some of these others, such as EAST or K-STAR or others, experimental plants, JT60SA in Japan. So there's that. There's also, because it has configurations and materials and other things that are very similar to ITER, it serves very well as a test bed. So one of the things that the US is assigned to procure on behalf of ITER, and I intimated this over and over, but I should have said back in the before 2010, say the 2005 to 2008 timeframe, when countries were deliberating how they would build ITER, one of the things that sets it apart from any experiment ever done is that they decided that they would break down the machine into components, and every country would build some. So rather than handing, 20 billion euros to Siemens or Areva or Westinghouse or some other nuclear, large plant giant, they wanted for contributions to be largely in kind. So Europe, as the host, makes 45% of the overall financial contribution to ITER, and each of the other countries, US, India, Russia, et cetera, contribute 9%, but they do it in the form of components. And so for most, that's in the range of 90%, maybe the US a little bit less, but it's about 90% of the contribution is not cash given to France, not cash given to the ITER organization, it's components. So putting all that together, one of the things that the US is supposed to contribute as part of its component contribution is what we call pellet injection. So this is an enormously challenging aspect that allows you to control the plasma. When you have any sort of distortion of this shape, you have to be able to control that in this microsecond. It's again, as with many of the technical specifications for ITER, it's an insanely challenging engineering parameter. JET allows the US to take the pellet injection designs that they've been making, send them over to the UK with US scientists and so forth, and they're able to test the efficacy of pellet injection in the JET plasma. So in that way, for expertise, for materials, for light configurations, JET is really a wonderful precursor.
I think, we've talked a great deal of very complex process, science, engineering, technology, planning, financing, economics, and even politics. And I think that at this point, it would help our audience with a better understanding of the uniqueness of ITER and everything that we've said so far. If you could share with us a video or a photo tour of the facility and a brief history of construction of the plant and manufacturing and shipment of various parts from different countries, because I know that some of these parts are so enormous that you must have had special provision for the supply chain, so to speak, for all these parts to arrive in a timely manner and be able to assemble them then.
Yeah, so I will be happy to try to share my screen here and give you this tour of ITER. Can you,
yes,
are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so let's go here. This is what you're seeing here is a bird's eye view of ITER world. Break in at any time if you have questions, but I'm going to minimize you and go directly into what you're seeing an overview of the ITER worksite. And despite the skill of this photographer's lens, no, we do not occupy that much of the world. But if you look at the aerial view of ITER, you will see here that we are situated in the mountains. It is for someone who wants to come from all these countries around the world. We're living here in Provence, so we're close to the Petit Luberon and the other mountain ranges that surround the ITER facility. And if you look at the facility itself, what you see is that I'm actually talking to you right here. I'm sitting right there in this headquarters building. Mm-hmm. And the site itself is about 1 kilometer long and about 400 meters wide, not counting this facility here, the storage facility where a lot of things come in and are stored, the smaller components. The bigger components come up the road from Marseille, and they make their way all the way to the ITER site along about 104 kilometer itinerary from countries all over the world. And they come through these roads. And
so you're 104 kilometers away from Marseille, and you're halfway
exactly.
Between Nice and Montpellier.
More or less, yeah, that's exactly correct. That's exactly correct, in the heart of Provence.
Yes.
And so it's a lovely place to live when you have the time.
I envy you, Laban. I envy you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was easy to talk my wife into moving from New York to ITER. So
well, New York is too shabby neither, Laban.
New York is wonderful, no question. But but knowing that we were going to be in Provence, I think softened the blow. But these components come in, and if they're big, they're stored. Sometimes they have additional conditioning and so forth. I'll talk to you about some of those in a moment. But they will essentially enter here eventually into a cleaning building, then an assembly hall, and then this is really the heart of the whole overall ITER facility, where the tokamak, the ITER reactor, will be housed. And I will try to take you into some of these buildings, but what you're really seeing here is that all of this entire site is either manufacturing facilities, 2 manufacturing facilities. Everything else is support systems that will drive this reactor or the experimentation. So first, since I'm talking to you in the U.S., let me start with the U.S. contribution, and there will be many U.S. contributions because this is a very complex very large Lego puzzle, if you like. But here, what you're seeing is I took you to the other end of the facility, and you have here the electrical switch yard, and there are really 2 overall electrical systems. So the transformers that you see here, these transformers are all supplied by the US, as is much of the electrical equipment in what we call the steady state electrical network. And by that term, it just means it's the normal industrial network that you would have at any industrial facility, or for that matter, for a city. This is the kind of thing that you have full of transformers and so forth that power your electrical grid with AC alternating current. Here, you have roughly a hectare. Again, you've got transformers, but these are coming from China. And this is what's going to make up what we call the pulsed power electrical network. And so you've got about a hectare of equipment, some of it from China, some of it from other contributors, which I'll mention in a bit, that is creating the ability to deliver a gigantic pulse, 450 megawatts, but only for a microsecond, that you use just at the very, very start. It is not a continuous. There are some that make the mistake that think that means we can't be efficient with ITER. No, you store this power up very quickly, and then you hold it. So this entire system sort of acts like a giant capacitor in its ability to drive the initial pulse of for a microsecond of the electricity needed by these giant electromagnets. Now, I'm going to be showing you some of these magnets that are actually completed, but some of them, many of them, come from all over the world. They come from, we have magnets being made in China, in Italy, in Japan, in the US, in San Diego, et cetera. But some are simply too big to ship, and other components we have that are too big to ship. So I will eventually take you to this building, which is owned by India. I'll explain why. And this one, red striped building, owned by the European Union. In this case, where they are making some of the magnets that are simply too big. Now, where I want to take you next is, where does this pulse? Oh, and I should say, because we won't come back to this, that all of these buildings are where either the ITER construction team lives, or their this is a parking lot, but where their contractors live. We have in total about I think we're over 1,000 ITER staff now, plus what we call ITER project associates, which are seconded staff from the domestic agencies in every ITER member country. And we also have contractors, both contractors for the domestic agencies that are building the buildings or other things, and contractors that are the ITER organization's own. So in total here, we have about 4,000 people on the ITER overall site. About 2,500 of those are workers, and that number is still creeping up. It will get up to about 3,000 total that are just on the worksite portion, not on the support facilities, but just on the worksite portion. So you can imagine what this was like when COVID hit in March of last year in France, and suddenly we were supposed to be going into lockdown. And as complex as this organization is, I'm going to be showing you how components from all over the world arriving makes for an extremely complex schedule. And if one factory shuts down, it doesn't just impact the completion of that component. If it impacts the arrival, what is there, and that machine has to be assembled in a particular sequence, what is all that going to do to the schedule of everybody else? Does everybody else put their device into storage? Does that mean they have to account for maybe new corrosion mechanisms or storage costs? So it's a very, very intricately connected project. And as managers, we were faced with this question: what do we do? Do we follow the French national ruling and everybody goes to remote working? Do we take our chances and risk a giant COVID outbreak? Because we've got people coming here from all over the world. So, we were determined we would not be a mechanism. And in fact, before masks were generally available everywhere, our Chinese counterparts sent us a gigantic shipment of masks, because we had taken and later Korea did the same thing, because we had taken the decision we would not shut down. We got as low as about 700, maybe 800 people on a given day. That was our lowest point, but we never stopped. And our project productivity, which goes, we monitor about 25,000 tasks every 2 months, and each one is weighted. That goes from design to fabrication to system building to construction to installation and system commissioning. So that allows us to say with authority every 2 months, this is how far we are in the ITER project. Right now we're at 75%. At that stage, we were much further behind. And so that means we have to make a progress of about 0.7% per month in order to meet the goal of a completed first functional test of the machine in December 2025. So we've had delays, but we couldn't stop. So that 0.7% per month got down to as low as about 0.4% per month. But if you look at what we've been doing as we go inside these buildings, you'll recognize that it was, in fact, a Herculean task. There has never, I am, of course, prejudiced. I will admit this because I work here, but I would be hard-pressed to find any complex project management achievement that equals what the ITER project did in the face of the last 18 months of COVID-19 coronavirus. And from March 15th, when we went into lockdown and continued, through the end of August, where we had started assembly and all of these giant components that I'm going to show you had begun to arrive, we did not have a single infection on the COVID worksite, not a single transmission. And we started to refer to it as the ITER miracle. And to be honest, we have now had we've had some, I think our peak week, we had something like 25 cases. But for that number of people and how amazingly the coronavirus was spreading in Provence, it was nothing. And now with the Delta variant spreading, we are still doing things that are more strict than what the French government is doing for, shopping malls and so forth, because we are determined we will keep, even under the Delta variant, with, most of our people vaccinated, we will keep this as COVID-free as possible. So let's go into these buildings next. This is when the electricity coming from the pulsed power network is being transferred from AC power into DC power inside what we call magnet power conversion buildings. That's these two. They're relatively identical. So when you go there, you will see in the out forms, the bays in the outside of this building, you will see that some of the equipment is being installed outside. Some of it, and this is equipment that must also include not what is here, but what is received and what goes in to this building where the magnets will be. And this building, which you see is less complete, which I'll get to at some point, it's the diagnostics building. I'll come to that. But if you go inside these buildings and consider all of the equipment, it's actually now equipment that is coming from not only China, but also Korea, India, and Russia. And so inside this building, what you have, to put it crudely, these are giant extension cords. These are basically bus bars, as we call them, which were shipped in the middle of the COVID lockdown across in giant truckloads, shipped over land from Russia through the middle of all of the lockdown and everything going on in Europe. None of these were here. They're now largely, not completely, but they're largely installed both in these buildings and in the tokamak building. And then you have transducers, and you have equipment for which I'm not an electrical engineer, so I can't even tell you all of the different pieces of equipment that we have sitting inside these buildings. Some still in wraps, just arrived, some freshly installed, that will all be part of what is essentially a very, very complex electrical device. Now, remember, not only are the magnets taking a lot of electrical power, they are also taking this super cooling, because they have to be superconducting, which means we have to take them down to this temperature of minus 265 degrees. So we were just in these buildings. Right next to them is this two buildings that make up the cryogenics facility. Now, CERN also use superconducting magnets, and they also use supercooling. These tanks are either liquid nitrogen or liquid helium. So liquid nitrogen will do some intermittent cooling. Liquid helium is what will actually take you down to this temperature of 4 degrees Kelvin, minus 269 degrees. So if you took every plant, every experiment at CERN and put it all together, it would be slightly larger. This is the Large Hadron Collider, everything. It would be slightly larger than the ITER facility. But ITER is the largest single platform cryogenics facility ever made. It will circulate 25,000 tons of liquid helium. So going inside.
Do you actually liquefy helium on site, or do you purchase liquid helium?
No. We purchase the helium, but we don't manufacture the helium. Our system also, that 25,000 metric tons, as you know, helium is a very precious resource. So
yes,
we don't plan to restock. This is a leak-free facility. Mm-hmm. We have to make this leak tight, but we take the incoming helium gas, mm-hmm. and we in these facilities we turn that into liquid helium. Mm-hmm. If you go inside those plants, what you will see is, again, to put it crudely, it's like opening the back of your refrigerator, mm-hmm. and you will just see quite a ton of compressors, wow. and pumps and valves, all designed to get you from incoming bottles, very large bottles of hydrogen helium gas, to making it liquid helium at minus 269 degrees. So that's what you're going to find inside these facilities: mm-hmm. compressors, valves, pumps, tanks, etc. Now, before we go further into the actual facility, before we I'm eventually going to take you, as I said, the components go into this cleaning building and into the assembly hall, and eventually into the tokamak. Before we go into all of this, I want to talk about two systems where I cannot, because there's not really much to see. I can't take you inside, or it's not really practical. So here you have the radio frequency building. Mm-hmm. So ITER will have three types of heating systems: the ion cyclotron heating system, the gyrotron heating system, and one that is not going to be here for the first functional test, what we call the neutral beam facility. That is being made at full scale in Italy, and they are testing at a full ITER scale, and then that will be translated. It will be installed here. It's hard to see it without a top-down view, but it's on the other side of the tokamak complex. But these two heating systems will be available for first plasma. First plasma in December 2025, and likely because of COVID slowdown, we will have some delays. We're examining that. We'll present a new baseline to the board, to the ITER Council, our governing body, in November. And then in the intermittent time that the council meets twice a year. So between November and June 2022, they will do an external review to say that the new baseline is correct and acceptable to all members, et cetera, et cetera. and then they will presumably ratify that in June 2022. So that means we will probably not make the 2025 December first plasma date, but we are exhibiting remarkable resilience. We have taken delays of 18 months and boiled them down to 6, and even in some cases 4 months and less. The different cultures, it is fascinating to watch the difference between Chinese project management and Russian and European and American and Japanese and Indian project management. Each really has its own culture. And when we do it well, that means we learn from each other because each one brings its own strength. But these gyrotrons are manufactured in Japan and Russia and the European Union and so forth. And then here you have the ITER. It looks small, but it's a gigantic stark, brutal sort of architecture. It's just a big heat exchanger. Much of that made by India. And there are these giant pipes here. And this is where you would normally have a turbine generator. If we were going to produce electricity, we'd shoot it from here and then run it across back to the grid. But instead, we need to have all the capacity to absorb the heat from ITER. So you have this, I mentioned, 500 megawatts that we might take as high as 750. So we've got a 1.2 gigawatt capacity to remove heat from the facility, right? So these pipes are here and then they run underground and they take the heat directly from the tokamak. Not that interesting to go into, but important to know for an understanding of the overall function. Mm-hmm. I would also mention that here you have storage for these temporary components and this rather strange looking thing. This is a cocoon, which is going around something that I'm going to explain a bit later. Inside this facility, this is one of the factories. It is the only factory owned by India. So India was tasked with making an overall sort of thermos that surrounds the entire tokamak. So it is literally the biggest component because it's got to hold everything. And obviously, if this is going to be 30 meters in diameter, and I don't know the combined weight, but the combined weight is probably something in the range of 3,000 tons. There was no way India could ship that. It is envisioned that they would make it in four components. So a base, a circle that's the next part of the cylinder, an upper cylinder, a lower cylinder, an upper cylinder, and a crown, a lid, right? So the first two, the base and the lower cylinder, are installed already in this building inside the ITER tokamak. The upper cylinder is stored here. Now, doesn't look very remarkable. That's just a piece of steel stored, for corrosion purposes, an Indian component stored inside a Dutch-made cocoon. But why is it remarkable? First, it's remarkable because this could not be shipped. So it had to be made inside this cryostat workshop, this Indian manufacturing facility. Secondly, that doesn't look very big, right? But to give you a sense of scale, this is roughly the size of Stonehenge. Wow. The circle of sarsen stones.
Yeah, I can say from those trucks on the ground.
You see the size of the trucks and suddenly you realize, wow, this is incredible. And it's also sort of, I think, mythical because nobody exactly knows what the people at Stonehenge were trying to do those thousands of years ago. But we do surmise from the way the sarsen stones are aligned that they were trying in some way to line themselves to external events. And so they were in some way trying to harness the power of the sun, maybe mythically or mystically all the way back then. But here we are recreating the same sort of power that these folks were trying to replicate in a much more physical way now, these thousands of years later. So we're following
that little cylinder, not little, giant cylinder over there was built inside the building and was transported outside the building. Was it built in one piece, or you said how was it taken out of the building?
Yeah, so this is a little bit perspective. So this cylinder is the same dimension as this door.
Oh,
this
okay.
door is just larger than the diameter of the cylinder. The cylinder was built in here. Let's go inside this building, the cryostat, and actually have a look at what. So this is the building. This is the storage, and now you see the scale. You can see that it's a little bit better proportioned here.
Yes, yes.
Right. So if we go inside this building, we can see them working on the top, the last component. I will show you later the bottom two pieces, the lower cylinder and the base. This is the lid. So the lid, what you can see here, the lid is arriving in these segments. You see it's missing a segment. That's because you could not possibly ship these things from India, where they are made in these. I visited this giant forging facility, and it's one of these, you know, the amazing capacity that India brings to the project is that they are still able to manufacture these high precision pieces of steel. In this case, you can see the steel has a curve. And so what they're actually doing, now we're at eye level, this is the missing piece of the facility. So, or of the tokamak lid. And the human aspect is equally remarkable, because here in the cryostat workshop, India was entrusted by the ITER project to develop this what they call the cryostat, not cryogenics, but cryostat. So a static component that would be able to hold the tokamak inside a light volume, not the heavy volume of the vacuum vessel, but a light volume, and a light vacuum, sorry, and at a relatively cool temperature, not cool to cryogenic temperatures, just a relatively cool temperature to minimize the heat load of other components. So this inability to ship and the international aspect, where the Indian welders, very good welders, were certified according to Indian standards, which in this case were not by certification process. It's a different standard than the European standard. And of course, the French insisted, because this is a nuclear facility under nuclear regulation in France, so we had to have European certification. So what do we have? Here we have a crack team of German welders, the company's called MAN, under Indian supervision, under French nuclear regulation, on an international facility, piecing together 54 pieces. You can see the weld lines, 54 pieces of precisely manufactured steel into an overall component that will be made up of 4 giant subcomponents: the base, the lower cylinder, the upper cylinder, and the lid. So that gives you another illustration of the international collaboration involved.
And that cap is made of stainless steel?
Yeah, it's a precise designed for purpose stainless steel. Yeah, a European designed austenitic stainless steel that was transferred to India for the forging. So now we turn to one more factory, this long red striped building, and then we will be going into the Holy of Holies, into the actual assembly hall here and the actual tokamak facility. But first, I want you to take a look with me at the magnets that we make here on site, because they are simply too big to transport. When we see later inside the assembly hall and the tokamak building, you will see the first installed magnet, which is about 10 meters in diameter. And so at that diameter, 30 feet in diameter, it was still manageable to bring this, after it arrived from China in Marseille. It was still possible to bring it up the ITER road, just occasionally brushing the trees. In fact, about 2 years ago, when we saw this was going to happen, and they had actually decided they were going to ship it flat instead of shipping it at an angle, we had to, the local authorities were gracious enough to cut away some of the cliff so that magnet would be able to pass. But if you go inside this building, you'll see that we have some magnets that are on the order of 17 or 24 meters in diameter, and that's simply too big to actually ship up the roadway. So what you're seeing here is how these magnets are actually manufactured. So if you ever had to make a motor or make a magnet winding in high school physics, you would have used wire. This is our wire. This wire is solid enough that if you have a good length of it, it makes for a nice bench press. It's quite heavy. It's niobium tin or niobium titanium, depending on which magnet we're actually using. We're actually making. There are two types of superconductor used. So it arrives at ITER in sort of a big round spool. This is an example you can just see in the background here of the spool of the magnet. And that's how it arrives. That's how it's manufactured and sent. So then it has to go through a series of machines that first of all straighten it both up, down, and side to side, straighten it perfectly. And it's not easy to do. This is very, very thick. I would say if you can see me on the screen, here's an example of a piece of that magnet. That is a cross section. So that's how thick the magnet is. It's not exactly wire when it comes to bending, but then it is cleaned, and then there are machines that shape it going this direction and over here going this direction. So you see the wire at the back. It's actually what we call a double pancake being made. It's laid down strip by strip in these spools, and it's a good illustration of multinational inaccuracy in language. This looks nothing like a pancake to an American. It is more of a bagel, if anything, but it is laid down in these what they call flat pancakes. And along the way, it's been wrapped. The metal has been wrapped in an insulating material. So then what you're going to get, if you go down from this station to the next, you'll see here's another one that's already been laid, wrapped in plastic until it gets used again. And you have a linear construction system all the way down the hall. So you go to the next station, and where we are just now, and you'll see that as we progress, we go from one magnet, one pancake, to the point where now we have a series. Now, what's happened in this case, we've gone from this one pancake. Now, this is a fully assembled PF5, colloidal field coil number 5. So what does fully assembled mean? We have stacked a series of about 8 of these pancakes into a single magnet. We have fused the ends together where one pancake ended and the other began, all the while ensuring that in the center of the magnet, so you have the niobium tin with a copper embedding and a steel casing, but in the middle, this is where the actual liquid helium is going to be running at minus 269 degrees to supercool the magnet. So that means that if you're joining these magnets one piece after another, one pancake after another, you have to ensure that the helium passage, everything has to be absolutely perfectly aligned for the superconducting to happen, so you don't get arcs, for the helium passage to be there. And then we're adding the pieces that will both structurally support the magnet. First, there's another step where we embed it in resin. So we have a machine, a table that holds the whole thing and tilts it so that the magnet, so that the air bubbles will come out of the resin. So it's to give it structural stability, because this magnet material, the superconductor we're using, is a bit brittle. It could be broken if it's not fully supported. So that's why you have so much of it, why it is wrapped so securely. And then at the end, you're putting in all of these other pieces. So that allows you then, here is where we're coming from, where we have the larger magnet. Now, this will allow us to take it to the next stage, where you'll actually, okay, so we're actually inside the magnet now in this photo. So by the human, you get an idea of how big this thing is, right? And what you would have remaining in the overall tour now is, if you continued, is you would actually have a flat layer, what looks like it's more magnet. It's not. This is a curved, this is one half of a curved cold test facility. So you pick the magnet up and you actually deposit it in here, put another circle on top, and then it looks like a giant worm or something. And then you can actually do cold testing to cryogenically verify that all the magnet is working as it is supposed to before you take it out of the facility, where in that, once we leave the facility, it will come out here and be trundled across either into temporary storage or going in the back of this cleaning building and into the assembly hall. So now we're going to go, now we will go into that assembly hall, but that's the process of making a magnet. That's really, really, really fascinating. You know, so we know that the liquid helium flowing through that little hole at the center of the conductor, of the superconducting conductor. Do you have an estimate of how much helium is required to cool down that massive amount of superconducting material after the entire magnet was built? And this whole structure has to be thermally sealed to make sure that you have a very low liquid helium boil off, right? Yeah, we don't plan to we don't want to be replenishing the helium because it's just so much so expensive and also so scarce. It's not something, as you know, anybody who's worked in a laboratory knows that helium, we're not doing as much with helium balloons as we used to play with them when we were kids. And here in the cryogenics facility that we visited just a few minutes ago, you have this is where the actual helium is taken from gas and made liquid, but this is the overall amount that you're going to have. It will be 25,000 metric tons of liquid helium. So wow. It is an amazing amount that is circulating in here. Yes. Yeah. In the United States, the price of liquid helium is roughly $10 a liter. So something like that. 25,000 metric ton. That 25 million kilogram, which is roughly 25 million liter. And if I suppose it's much more expensive in Europe and in the rest of the world, because US has a massive liquid helium reservoir. Yeah. So we're talking about $250 million just of liquid helium. Yeah, and that's why you don't, that's why the system, well, that is one reason that the system has to be airtight, because you don't want to waste the helium. The other one is that you have to, the reason it has to be so absolutely tight is because the magnets themselves, you want no breaches. You do not want to, it's a system of continuous circulation. Yeah. So let's go in the assembly hall now. That's the big building here. That is, we're going to go, well, the magnet would come out of the building we were just in and go into this cleaning facility, because this is all now operating as a complete clean room. So inside the assembly hall, what you've got is the ability to put all of these giant components together. So the overhead cranes that you're seeing here, each pair can hold about 750 tons. So in combination, 1,500. The heaviest load for ITER was actually the first component installed in the tokamak, which was about 1,250 tons. That was the base, the first part of the cryostat that we were talking about earlier. And I will show you that installed in a bit. But the components come in here in the back after they leave the cleaning facility, and then they are hoisted with not only a lot of strength, but incredible precision that these cranes can use. So that's one tool. The next tool, which I'll show you on another picture as well, you have two standing behemoths here. These are 800-ton tools made by Korea. And the purpose of these tools is to make a quote sub-assembly in of a vacuum vessel sector. So a vacuum vessel sector comes in with four of them made, well, representing 1/40th of the overall torus that is the tokamak. So 40 degrees, 1/9, 40 degrees of that circle. That means that 9 of them will be made in total, 4 in Korea, 5 in Italy. And the first one from Korea has arrived. it is to be assembled here, held in sort of the belly of this overall tool. And then what you have is these external arms that can move with absolute precision along these tracks. So you start with pieces of thermal shielding that are ultra thin and very shiny. They're silver coated. They really look like a jewel. And the reason for that is because as a thermal shield, they are designed to give you not the full protection from 150 million degrees inside and the cryogenics on the outside, but even though that's we have the magnetic cage that holds that in, there is of course a giant temperature gradient, and so the thermal shield helps that. In addition, you have two magnets, D-shaped magnets, added to each one of these vacuum vessel sectors. So in combination, two pieces of thermal shield, two magnets, one vacuum vessel sector, you assemble all of this in these tools using various, this is a lifting tool. This will actually, you can lay this down flat, put a magnet on it, and then gently raise it to the position it is here, so that the D-shaped magnet is actually held by this tool. Then the overhead cranes pick it up and they carefully transfer it to this tool so that these arms can sort of close like angel's wings and bring the two magnets together to a point where they are united with the vacuum vessel sector and can be welded in place. And that has to occur 9 times. So that you get your final piece. Now, here you see the tool we're going to the opposite end of the hall now. So this is where we were before. And now you can see that you have in these tools, you see where now you can see a bit more where this is the track where the arms will move, and the belly of the first one, it's not very easy to see, but in here, you actually have the first vacuum vessel sector that arrived from Korea last fall. That is actually, I think it arrived in France. We celebrated on about 27th of July, and then it arrived at the ITER site about the first week of August. So we've been working now to condition that. It's now in there. We've added elements of the thermal shield, and the D-shaped magnets will be added soon to that. So that's really the assembly process. And then what happens is that it's taken from there and will be lifted. Again, these overhead cranes run all the way from the assembly hall. This is the border into the tokamak building, right? So it will go all the way in and down into the tokamak pit, which is a bit hard to see, but we'll be going into the tokamak pit very directly. So that is your overall process. This is one more photo where you can see here. This is the actual vacuum vessel sector. So now we're inside the giant tool that I was showing you. That is 1/9 of the vacuum vessel. Inside, you can see quite a lot of sort of these bosses that will have various diagnostic tools, observation ports, everything that you can imagine, every single way we can imagine to analyze the plasma as scientists. And here on the outside, you can see the shiny part. That is the very, very thin thermal shield. Now, there's an interesting story about the thermal shield. There are, because of all of these first-of-a-kind components that are challenging, companies like, in this case, Hyundai Heavy Industries, who made these, but the same could be said of General Atomics or Mitsubishi Heavy Industries or Rosatom or Larsen and Toubro in India or various, Chinese or other. Every member has had their own major companies involved, but there are spin-off effects. So the European Union did a calculation a while back, looking at for every euro spent on ITER, what is the return to the economy? And there are obvious returns because their companies are getting the funding to make these components and so forth. But there are also, and of course there are jobs, there are all of those normal things. But considering that the other members are not actually giving money to the European Union, they're contributing components, where is the real payoff? And a lot of that payoff comes in spin-off effects. So this thermal shield, to give you an example, after Korea perfected how to make something this large, this precise, this thin, and to have the silver coating across all of it, they realized that they had something that could also be used for their liquefied natural gas containers. Because when you're shipping LNG, liquefied natural gas, you have the same issue. You do not want to lose, you want a barrier between the temperature gradient that is the ambient air, or what the shipping that you're doing, and the super, super cool liquefied natural gas inside. You want to lose as little heat as possible for efficiency on that trip. And so they're now making, based on what they learned from ITER, they are making better, more efficient liquefied natural gas containers. That's just one aspect of that.
I can imagine so many new technologies coming out of this project just because of the extreme needs and requirements for the engineering, design, and implementation, construction, and assembly of various parts. It's always like that. The kind of spin-off technology that came out of the US space program, it's unbelievable. I mean, I expect no less than that
Sure.
from ITER.
It's true. And CERN, I mean, CERN does not have, one might say it does not have a practical endpoint, at least not as concretely as what ITER does. But there have been many, many practical applications, from the World Wide Web to much else that has come out. So we're now going to go across here, and you can't even see it here, but we're going to go down into the tokamak pit that actually sits on the other side. Now, before we do that, in the tokamak complex, we're going to go into this building, but this is the tritium building. And you can see that because the tritium building is not so far, it will not be used for first plasma, because as I mentioned a bit earlier, we will only use regular hydrogen for first plasma. The tritium building is one of those elements that will be built out fully during the post first plasma series of stages of build. Also, while I'm out here, I would mention there will be a control building, which is actually there's just groundworks under construction there. Here in the foreground, I mentioned that if you remember, this was the building sticking out from the assembly hall where we have the two heating systems. There is another heating system going in here, which is being made in Italy, as I mentioned, the neutral beam system. And then there is a hot cell system. So in other words, a hot cell complex where the robots will deliver certain components that have been already radiated and exchange them out or do maintenance and take them back in. That will be in this construction area that right now is just a staging area. So that will all be going on. Now we go just to illustrate the clean room. This is the tunnel we take to get from the assembly hall into the tokamak complex. And what you get then, this is the top-down view of our I don't know, what should we call it, cathedral or Colosseum. Sitting at the base of that Colosseum are several components that we've talked about. This, to give you a sense of scale, that's the 10-meter magnet.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that magnet is the first installed magnet. It's PF6. PF5, which will go up here on these supports, is the one that you just saw in the assembly hall.
Mm-hmm.
That will be the next one going on. Then we'll have other supports, and you will have another magnet that goes almost fully to the diameter of that one will be 17 meters. This one will be 24 meters, another 24 meters, and then a narrower one, and at the top, a small one that's being made about this size again, that's being made in Russia, in St. Petersburg. So that's the magnet system. Now, I mentioned the cryostat base. You may find it hard to see. I'll show you another view in a moment, but right here, if you go around the parameter, this, where you see these little lines, this at the bottom is the cryostat base. So it's both this platform and then a side coming up here and this platform extending out. That whole thing is the base of the cryostat, the thermos that encircles everything. And then you'll notice that here you see concrete and here you see steel, right? So that is because at the edge of the cryostat base, we added the lower cylinder, which is like the one I showed you outside, stored in a cocoon, about the size of Stonehenge, 10 meters high and 30 meters in diameter. Well, this component, the first component, the base, at 1,250 tons and 30 meters across, was laid down again by these overhead cranes, remember, was laid down with a precision under 3 millimeters at every metrology point.
Wow.
So again, somewhat insane engineering. And when you get to then this is a view where you can actually see. In fact, my cousin is an opera singer, and my dream is to bring him and a full quartet of opera voices. I don't know if we'll pull it off, but I would love to have them, standing at these ports and giving me a full operatic rendition here before we close this tokamak up. But we'll see if my dream becomes a reality. But here you can see the size of the magnet. Each one of these components, even if it looks quite simple, is developed with extraordinary precision, even if its purpose is just to hold this this facility in place, because the entire complex that we've been looking at is actually positioned here underneath on 400 and something seismic pillars. When it was there, they looked sort of like the being in Xi'an in China with the terracotta warriors. There are these warriors standing under here, and it is possible to have seismic activity in Provence, but the real reason we're doing this is to be sure that we can position a full facility with that amount, 23,000 tons, all of that weight, that it can actually hold and remain on point without distortion in a seismic event. Then in addition, the component that has now arrived just as of a couple of weeks ago in Marseille, the first central solenoid module coming from San Diego from the US. The US's major contribution will be right here in the center. So aligned right along this center line. And in fact, what you have here is just a tool. We will add tools that go all the way up, because the central solenoid will not be installed immediately. So when we bring these sections of vacuum vessel and lower them here into the pit, they will be aligned all the way around, vacuum vessel along with the D-shaped magnets coming round and round. And these will be supported simply during assembly by this tool. This is just a tool, and it will have several more increments going all the way up. So the tool will hold everything in place, but then the central solenoid eventually will come in here. So now you will have a central aligned solenoid. You will have these ringed magnets going flat around the outside, and the D-shaped magnets going around the torus in each direction. That's how you get the combination of the three pieces of the magnetic field.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago I was reading an article about the shipment of that piece from San Diego, and all the extreme measures they had to implement in order to accommodate the weight.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that is your tour of the ITER facility. I hope that was also fun and enlightening. I hope that all of your listeners and Alayar, you yourself will at some point, depending on COVID restrictions and hoping we get through this, that you'll be able to visit us physically. We do give visitor tours. Those tours vary week to week because of what can or cannot be accessible in a highly industrialized construction site. But we do our best to give those tours in person. But I hope that this virtual tour helped you as well.
That would be my dream to visit that site. I have to make a confession here that wherever I'm traveling in Europe, when I'm going to Spain or Italy or Holland, I fly into Paris. Regardless of where I'm going, I fly into Paris and then drive in Europe. I love driving in Europe.
Yeah.
I've driven straight from Maastricht for 28 hours to Cannes. I had a conference, I had a talk to give in Maastricht, and then the next day I had a talk in Cannes, and I drove 20 hours straight. And actually I barely arrived, on time to walk, park my car and walk on the stage and be able to give my talk. That's how much I love France and love Europe and the nature and the driving experience there.
I like it as well, but it also labels you as having been corrupted by the American culture. It's quite funny. When my wife and I moved, I met my wife in Vienna, and when we moved to New York, for her, the idea that we would actually be so insane as to drive to Florida just seemed outrageous, because in Europe, the countries are much smaller, and so that kind of a drive, it happens, but you certainly don't do it regularly. And 6 hours or 10 hours is considered quite a lengthy drive. So I understand. I fully share your sentiments about travel in Europe.
I won't even tell you about my drive from New York to Los Angeles.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I want you to talk a little bit about the heart of the fusion reactor, which is a machine called tokamak machine that confines, as you explained, before, it confines a plasma using magnetic field, the magnetic field that's generated by those magnets that you just demonstrated. So the plasma is kept away from the vessel wall by a very strong magnetic field and magnetic coil that's placed around the vessel. I mean, the ultimate temperature of the plasma is brought to about 200 million, 300 million, as you said, degrees centigrade. By the time you get that high, it doesn't really matter whether it's 200 million or 300 million. No form of matter can stay, in any condition, in any state other than plasma state. And you need that temperature to overcome the natural electromagnetic repulsion between protons and cause collision to fuse the protons together and release this enormous amount of energy that's really hidden inside these protons. So could you put some details on this picture and how you hope to achieve such extreme conditions?
Sure. If I may, I am going to use an object for an object lesson for this. So on our website, we realized it's at a certain point that we had a lot of fans, and it was getting bigger and bigger around the world. And we also really wanted to inspire young people. So I convinced some of my colleagues in Hungary at their Center for Nuclear Research in Hungary, and Center for Energy Research. They came up, they took the actual CAD drawings that we use, which are extraordinarily heavy files, and they dumbed them down a bit until they came up with files that could be 3D printed. So what I have that I will try to use to answer your question is actually a model here, a 3D model of the tokamak. Mm-hmm. And it's all 3D printed. We now have maker spaces and others around the world who are manufacturing, quote, their own tokamak so that they can follow us along in the assembly process. So here at the bottom is the base of this cryostat, the gray piece. Mm-hmm. That's the 30 meters in diameter. This is exactly 1/100th scale. So if I've got something here that's 30 centimeters, that means it would be 30 meters. So at the very, very base, you can see, if I don't drop anything out, well, first of all, you see these round magnets,
yes,
right? So
yes.
This is the one being manufactured in not Moscow, but St. Petersburg. Mm-hmm. The next one is 17 meters. That's the one that is in process, that you saw in process being made in the long red striped building where we were making the big magnets. Mm-hmm. This is the next scale. These are 24 meters. And at the bottom inside, if you could tilt it without dropping everything out, you would see the other magnets, yes, that are there inside. Yeah. Yes. So then in the vacuum vessel, you have these in what you see in blue here. This is the second set of magnets. This is the D-shaped magnets that I was referring to. Mm-hmm. These in mm-hmm. blue. So you have 18 of these, 9 made in Italy and 9 made in Japan, plus 1 extra. Actually, Japan's making 10, so we have a spare. But those are being made in those 2 countries. And then in the center, you have this one that you read the article about, the central solenoid. Mm-hmm. Now, the central solenoid is being made in 6 modules, because in total it's about 13 meters high. In fact, if you include all of the supports around, it's about 18 meters high. So you simply could not, again, too big to ship. But General Atomics figured out a way to do it in a modular way. Mm-hmm. And so the first module, as you've been reading in the news, has arrived in France. So how does that work? Well, basically, these gray sections inside here are vacuum vessel sectors. Each one basically 1/9 of the total. And what you were seeing on those big tools in the assembly hall, this model does not show thermal shielding, but it shows this being held in the belly of the beast, and then the two of these blue, they're not blue, of course, but two of these D-shaped magnets being attached to it with the thermal shielding. So how does this actually now work in the machine? What essentially happens is that to get to 150 million degrees, let me start with that. You're using three overall heating systems. The first one, you run a current through the gas. That you inject gas in. This is the deuterium tritium gas, forms of hydrogen, and you run a current, and the current works just like a fluorescent light bulb. It changes the gas to the fourth state of matter, plasma, separating the electrons from the nuclei, so everything is in a free floating ionized soup. In a light bulb, that gives you fluorescent light. In this case, it will give you a plasma, an initiated plasma. Now, you then start heating by way of microwaves, much like you might have in your house, just a lot bigger and quite a lot of them. And those microwaves then are your second heating system. Your third heating system is then the one that's being built to full scale in Italy, that will be a neutral beam. So it's when I say a neutral beam, it is a beam of neutral uncharged particles coming in that will further heat the plasma, as we do, say, with one billiard ball hitting another, and there are many molecular reactions, atomic reactions where that occurs. So the central solenoid pulses. That's the only magnet here that pulses. So I've used the illustration that this magnet, the most powerful magnet ever made, about 1,000 tons with all 6 modules together, will be strong enough to pick up an aircraft carrier. Wow. These, if you saw in the assembly hall where I showed you those big machines, these are each about the weight of a Boeing 747. Okay, so that's what you're assembling here. 23,000 tons in total. So you get the pulse coming from this one, and that pulse then creates a helical, you know how you will see if you use magnetic filings, if you have a magnetic line and it's done with precision, yes, the filings will align themselves on that line. That's what we're doing. All these charged particles in here are magnetic, and they will align. This will create a circular helical pulse that is going a set of magnetic lines together with these D-shaped magnets that are actually shaping and helping to further confine the plasma. But in combination, they will tend to push it away from the middle. And so you have these outer magnets that then keep it in shape. And in combination, this is how in combination you create this precise magnetic field that is precisely aligned to the shape of the vacuum vessel. If you take a cross section, you'll see that the magnetic cage really conforms. At the bottom here, these components are being partly designed. They're different parts, but they're partly being designed in Russia, part in Europe. And what happens with these components, this is called the diverter. This will have the biggest heat load because as the helium nuclei from the fusion reaction, continue to heat the plasma, as they lose that heat and energy, they drift to the bottom. So we call it ash, even though it's nothing looking like ash. But that gives the highest heat load because they're collected here in the diverter. So this is a tungsten coated monoblock because tungsten can withstand about 3,000 degrees, and that's how we will be collecting. And these are modular, so that hot cell facility that I was talking about, these will be able to be removed one by one from the vacuum vessel, and we can rotate them. They can move around a circle and move to take the helium ash out of the vacuum vessel. So so
you're going from a temperature of 150 million, 300 million at the center of that D-shaped object to a temperature of, I suppose you expect it to be a temperature of less than 3,000 degrees centigrade so that it doesn't melt the tungsten diverter.
Exactly. Yeah, that's when it releases and drops to the bottom. But it will. That's from experience. That's the point at which the helium ash no longer becomes part of the actual, in other words, the helium is no longer heating, and it's lost enough heat that it is both tolerable to the tungsten, and it is sinking to the, it's no longer interacting in the plasma, just out of gravity. So so what you're getting in that case is also we also have two other control devices that I should mention. One stationary, which is the Chinese, in addition to these three magnet systems, which is the only three we normally talk about, they are also making some small, meaning they're in the range of like 10 tons each, correction coils. So you can slightly adjust to further make the depending on what is how you are tuning the magnetic field, you can do a little bit of tuning of that. In addition, the US is making, I mentioned when we were talking about JET, this pellet injection. The US is making a pellet injector that can shoot a solid pellet of fuel into the machine, and that can help you to react very quickly to any kind of because you will have, as you get a concentration in some area of the plasma, a concentration of fusion events, you can have distortion. So you have to have, sub-micron second ability to react very quickly and control that. That's how you're doing the ongoing continuous control, which the we call it ELM, local electron load modeling, which will enable you to actually it's a control system enabling you to respond near instantaneously to any sort of concentrated fusion event that might distort your magnetic field or challenge it.
That's really amazing, and I assume that all of this has before you even spend a penny, all of this has been simulated by probably a general contractor who eventually has assured the decision makers about the implementation of this project that such a thing is possible. I mean, that amazing temperature gradient at the center of that D-shaped magnet of dropping from 150 million to about 3,000 degrees centigrade, that by itself, I mean, being able to reenact that in the real world is it's nothing less than really scientific miracle. And the more I hear about this, the more eager I get to see it in fruition, and someday visiting there when you actually start up the magnet and start harnessing this power. So my next question is, given that they use to use fusion for power generation, it takes construction of a facility like ITER, one of the most which is, I think, one of the most complex, if not the most complex, scientific and engineering project in the world, with a price tag, as you mentioned, of $20 billion to generate 500 megawatts of power, while the typical price tag of 1,000 megawatt fission power plant is about $5 billion, depending on who is manufacturing it. What justifies a technology that is 8 to 10 times more expensive than fusion reactor specifically, that there are around 400 such fission power plants in operation around the world. Now, if ITER is successful, do you think that going from the prototype, which is ITER, to an actual power plant based on tokamak, the price reduction would be high enough to be able to compete with the fission reactors and other modes of energy generation?
I would say yes, definitely. It's a complex question, and thanks, because it's a very good one. What I would say, Alayar, is that when you look at first of all the solutions available to us for combating climate change, and you think about those in terms of carbon-free energy, maybe some transitional energy production with things like natural gas, because it's lower in its carbon emissions than coal. But if you look at many of the technologies that will be discussed this December in Glasgow, when countries are coming together to discuss climate change and how do we get to net zero, to be honest, they tend to discount fusion as being a non-proven technology. But in reality, the massive scale up of renewables, while we've gotten the price point down in terms of production, we have not figured out, most of those are being manufactured with, to be honest, with Chinese coal. So in other words, the electricity that is used to power the facilities that make solar photovoltaics and turbines and so forth must also be made from a carbon-free electricity generation, or else you're shooting yourself in the foot, getting carbon-free by emitting more carbon. So that, and the fact that the scale up of, while we've gotten the price down, which is admirable, of renewables, the actual scale up has not been tested in a realistic setting in anywhere in the world, in the sense that you take the concentration of humans moving to cities, and you take a large city, whether that's of the size of 2.8 million people in the St. Louis metropolitan area, or you scale all the way up to New York City or Mexico City or Tokyo or something like that. So we have not yet begun to confront the local community reaction to the unbelievable amount of land use that you start to have to sacrifice in the vicinity of those cities in order to blanket it with renewables. So when you come to a fission plant, you have selective acceptance. There are very few countries right now that are actively building. There are some, but there are very few that are actively building fission plants. And I don't know of any that are saying we're going to use fission plants to replace all of not only the electricity that we have. In France, as I mentioned, we have more than 70% of our electricity coming from fission. That's the highest percentage in the world. In the US, it's around probably just under 20%, maybe 15 or 20% of the electricity. But then you have all of that additional energy, which is right now, for heating, for transportation, for agriculture, for many other uses. And that all has to have a clean end use as well, either electricity or hydrogen fuel cells. So you're really talking about this massive, massive scale up. When we come to Glasgow, you will be hearing people talking about the solutions as scale up of renewables, which I would argue is also not a fully tested, socially tested, technologically tested phenomenon. Then you also have carbon capture, and that's being touted as if it is a known phenomenon, a known science, where in fact, except for Norway being able to so far store quite a lot of CO2 in an underground cavern that was really, evacuate, where they took already the natural gas and petroleum out, and now they're restoring it, and they're hoping that it holds up in terms of any seismic event and doesn't create a giant methane burp to the environment. We have a lot of things that are not tested, and we're going to need probably all of them. So now let's come back to your question about pricing, but I really want that background context. Europe is importing about $1 billion worth of petroleum products every day. So they are paying for an ITER equivalent every 3 weeks. The US is not, although the shift from Trump to Biden administration, we'll have to see exactly how the production or import or any other kind, how the US plays out on the as a net fossil fuel, net oil exporter or not. You have to really see how that plays out. But within those numbers, we now come to the 20 billion spent on ITER, and that is total construction through first plasma. That's the number. In the way that I should first talk about the accuracy of that number, because in the way that I described each of ITER's member countries contributing components, not all of them publish their costs, and they're not required to. So you have the US and Europe that are publicly disclosing their budgetary figures for how much it costs. And we know that Europe is supplying about 45% of the machine and US and all the rest supplying about 9% of the machine. But those figures, those cost figures are we know what they have spent, but that percentage was actually based on value, not actual expenditure. It was set, 12, 15 years ago or 12 years ago when the facility was being divided up. You make this component, you make this component. So we have the 20 billion is an estimate based on what we know of Europe and what we can estimate about, in some cases, lower materials costs or labor costs in some of the other countries, China, India, Korea, Japan, et cetera, where they might have equal or lower costs, but unpublished numbers. So that's an estimate. I would argue that it is a much more accurate estimate. You will sometimes see for people who are trying to disparage ITER that there was a Department of Energy estimate of 65 billion, which again shows you this wide range, what is accurate. And that was actually based on the fact that the US tends in project management to always produce a very, very high number for contingency, whereas our Asian friends tend to build zero contingency into their budget. And it was an interesting international discussion. Do we or do we not use a contingency number? And since we set the baseline of cost and schedule in 2016 here at ITER, we've not varied from it at all. The costs have stayed the same. So those predictions in the US of spending a lot more have not come true. That's not to say with something like COVID, for example, that there would not be some cost escalation, but we don't think it will be that high. And those US numbers had been compounded and compounded and compounded to get to that $65 billion number. So I think 20 billion is a fairly accurate estimate. Now, consider that because we are an experimental machine, I showed you that giant diagnostics building, which is nearly half the size of the tokamak building itself and packed with every conceivable form of equipment. That is not a commercial device. That is a research device. That labels it as being something where I don't know exactly, but I would say in a commercial machine, once you've got the commercial design ready to go, you're probably going to have between 10 and 20% of that overall diagnostics, because this is a research device. So we expect, as I said before, to put 50 megawatts of heating into the facility, into the plasma for 500 megawatts out. But in reality, we are using 3 different types of somewhat redundant systems with much more heating capacity than that. Why? Not because we want to be inefficient, but because we're an experimental device. So we want to test which in combination with which makes your endpoint best. We're going to be testing different forms of tritium breeding. We are using superconducting magnets now that must be cooled to minus 269 degrees, even as tests and scale up is ongoing for a later superconductor that would only need to be cooled to about minus 70 degrees. So you wouldn't need all of that cryogenics facility complex. So there are multiple aspects that would suggest that the actual cost, even if without efficiencies, just the actual cost of building an ITER-like device, an ITER-like commercial fusion device, where you had a turbine generator, but you took away the cooling systems. I mean, you substituted part of that because that's what the turbine generator would really do. And you took out some of these extras that are built in. And then you benefited from all of the knowledge that right now is going into making these things. As we talked, these major companies are building first-of-a-kind components they did not know how to build. Nobody had ever built something to that scale and precision. Now that we know, all of those design and research and all of that R&D aspect is vested in ITER. And while you will continue to have R&D, there's no reason to assume that the capital costs of a fusion device, a fusion power plant, commercial power plant, would be any more than that of a nuclear fission device. In fact, because of the safety aspects, you don't have, and the lack of moving parts. I mean, we're shooting pellets in, and the gas is moving, but you don't have pumps, and there are cryogenic pumps, but the magnets are staying in one place. You don't want them moving. So that means that maintenance. It means that longevity, all of those factors are generally expected to be better for a tokamak than for a fission device, with the exception of what is the right material to use on the first wall, the primary wall that gets impacted, because that could suffer neutron embrittlement and need to be replaced. So there are many R&D projects going on. Should we use a liquid wall? Should we use a differently configured wall, etc.? Now, when you come to the kilowatts, everybody wants to know what's the kilowatts per hour. I can't give you a good number. I think it will be competitive. I think likely the fusion plants of the future will be the cost will be similar to fission in the sense large capital cost, relatively low operating costs, lower regulatory oversight costs because the safety is much greater, and the overall operating and maintenance costs should be quite simple, and the fuel costs are almost nil. Your fuel costs are quite negligible. But there are two more factors to consider. One is if you think in terms of the areas of science and engineering that could be the most impactive on this question, what could change that outlay? One of them is, as we study a burning plasma, and even a plasma where it gets more heating, you get to something called ignition, where all of your heating is coming from the fusion reaction itself, no external heating at all. So you're starting it, but once you're starting it, you're not pressing the key for continuous heating. You kick it off, and then you just run with ignition. So all you're doing then is just putting in fuel, but other than that, it is a fully self-sustaining reaction. That will bring down costs if we know how to optimize, because your heating system cost then comes away quite a lot. Secondly, the areas like advanced manufacturing, there is much more now than even 5 years ago about the ability to 3D print in bi and tri-metallic composites, where you're not doing it from a powder, but from almost like welding. So it's got tremendous ductility, and all of your metallic metallurgy, all of your measurements there, the ability to build things without welding, etc. So fabrication, advanced manufacturing and fabrication could have a big impact. Material science, which is again a field that's just racing, that could have a big impact. Those would be the considerations that will be an influence on the answer to your question by the time we're ready to build commercial plants. The last aspect is one we don't talk about very much, but if you were to ask what is the cost of that the nations of the world, or just the US, in the last 20 years or 50 years or 150 years that we have put into conflict, wars, alliances, in order to secure access to petroleum resources. How much has that cost us? Not just in dollars, but in geopolitical alliances and in the resultant wars and the resultant aid and so forth. Imagine if every country on the planet had equal access not only to the sun and the wind to fuel their renewables, but also to their concentrated baseload power plants, the fuel for that, which is completely abundant deuterium and lithium to breed tritium. Imagine what that geopolitical scenario could look like, and how much economically that could make. The economic impact of that is incalculable. Not to say that I believe blissfully that humans will reach a point where there will be no conflicts, but in the sense of positioning for petroleum, both what we can define factually and what we suspect have been the motivations of various conflicts, that's a huge economic aspect to be considered. Now, lastly, for when will we get to commercial fusion? There are as many different roadmaps with timelines to fusion power as we have members in ITER. So if you look at the Eurofusion roadmap, the European Union, they are tending to be, so far, logical and sort of, I would not say plodding, but conservative in sequential steps. Once ITER gets to full fusion power in 2035, we will begin finalizing the design of demo, which is a machine that would follow. If it uses all the same technology, which it will not, it would need to be correspondingly bigger because they would want a bigger Q, a bigger output versus input factor. And that would be your first machine driving electricity to the grid. So if you estimate that you start construction in 2040 and you finish it in 2055, then your first generation of commercial machines is probably in the 2070s. If you look at the extreme other end, you have China building the China Fusion Experimental Tokamak Reactor. I think it's something like that, CFETR. I may not have the acronym exactly right, but China is already, has completed the conceptual design and is working on the engineering design for building a machine that is only slightly different than ITER. And their intention is that as soon as we hit first plasma, which is now scheduled for 2025, but as I mentioned, there's an ongoing evaluation of COVID impacts, it might be 2026. But in any case, once that's done and we demonstrate general machine functionality, China will take all the intellectual property that they have managed and that others have managed and try to work together to build an ITER-like machine with a phase 2. So they get all of that knowledge and with a phase 2, connect that to the grid. And they would want that connected to the grid by 2040. Can they do it? It's really challenging, who knows? But Boris Johnson announced a little while back, I don't know exactly the date, that the UK would be trying to build a fusion pilot plant, which means trying to produce electricity to the grid by 2035 or 2040. The US National Academies, first of all, the FESAC, which is DOE's, the Department of Energy has something called the Fusion Energy Science Advisory Committee, FESAC, and they came out with a report in, I think, February of this year, and about the same time, really very close to the same time, a long-term study that had involved private sector and academia and government came out with a report through the national academies in the US, again, saying, looking for a 2035 to 2040 build of a pilot plant in the US. Now, those pilot plants would have the advantage of ITER's scale up, the intellectual property we're gaining right now, how to scale up technology. They would also have, if MIT has a spin-out company called Commonwealth Fusion, which is building something called Spark. And Spark is a machine that's much like ITER. It is more spherical, where ours is a bit more D-shaped. The donut is a little distended in ITER. And they are using these high-temperature yttrium-based superconductors. The same is true of Tokamak Energy, a private company in the US. The Fusion Industry Association in the US is focused on private sector enterprises, and they have 17, 20, something like that, private sector enterprises trying to beat all of ITER's predictions and come out with something faster. Some of those are based on, all of them are based on sound engineering and science, but some of that engineering and science is much, much less tested than the ITER-style tokamak. Some of it has new features like the different types of magnets. In one case, General Fusion in Vancouver has built successively larger machines and now has gotten permission from the UK government to build their next machine in the UK. Their device is utterly strange. It takes, similarly, a plasma, but it has coordinated pistons around a sphere that compress and get you to the appropriate temperature and pressure and fusion events in a concentrated pressure way, in what has to be absolutely infinitely precisely timed. So everybody's got their own challenges, and some, we hear rumors of Lockheed Martin wanting to build a fusion device that'll fit on the back of the truck. We know that Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos have all invested in one way or another in fusion, commercial fusion enterprises. And some of them have very, very aggressive timelines. When you have the discussion between an ITER set of scientists and those folks, we used to hear a lot of sort of poo-pooing of each other's ideas, or that'll never work, or you guys are taking too long, or whatever else. And the truth is that a lot of that sort of competitive discussion has died down because we're all in this race together. All of us have got exactly the same endpoint. We want to create the ability for human society to tap in to replicating the energy of the sun and the stars, so that our kids get a better legacy than the one we inherited and the one we contributed to.
Very well said. Actually, you already answered my last question, which was about the commercialization and the feasibility of whatever design comes out of ITER and all the other competitive models and competitive designs that you alluded on. I think the model that Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are investing on is called a Stellatron or something like that. That it's basically a different engineering design for the plasma confinement, and whatever it is, I think these kind of competitions are healthy, and we should not discourage each other, but feed from each other's energy to have more conviction about especially the multinational nature of such a project. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is probably the largest international cooperation among nations who are otherwise, always competing on military grounds, on nuclear technology development, on economic grounds, and this is a very healthy environment that you have created. And one of the least advantages that such a project can have is the spirit of cooperation among nations and contribution to the peace, and especially comparing it with the other technology, with the fission technology that easily lends itself to miniaturization and the development of nuclear bombs and the delivery and all of that. The fission technology does not, because of the sheer enormity and the complication. It will never lend itself to unpeaceful uses, and that is another reason that such a technology should be supported, and everybody who hears about it should be very excited about it, and in that regard, you're really contributing to peace and a better life on this planet by simply advocating this and disseminating information about it, and for our little part, for your preparedness and help and kindness and generosity of spending more than 2.5 hours with us explaining everything. I thank you very much. And I thank everybody who is involved, all the unseen friends who are working tirelessly for all these years to make this a successful project. I, on behalf of the entire humanity, I thank them, and I wish them the best of luck and excitement and success in every aspect of life, including success for this project. And if you have any concluding remarks, Laban, I'll be able to give you a few more minutes before we close the interview.
Yes, well, and thank you, Alayar, for giving me this platform. I look forward to hearing from you at some point about the feedback of your listeners. I'm happy to give you the time. I think that one of our big missions specific to communication has been simply to raise awareness. We want to educate young people. We want to inspire people about this. We want honesty and transparency in terms of both the challenges and the costs, but also the benefits and what it could really mean. And you have much more than many of the people that interview me. You have very wisely highlighted the aspects of science diplomacy and the benefits of countries coming together in ways that can produce not only an energy legacy, but also can help us to think about collaborating in very practical terms, pooling our knowledge and expertise on these massive challenges. And there's this old biblical legend, the story of the Tower of Babel, mm-hmm. and the way in which humans have at that time tried to come together to build the characteristic Middle Eastern ziggurat to get to the, to reach the stars, and the folly of grandiose human ambition. And I think of that story quite often because the legend has it that God then dispersed them, and up to that point they could all speak the same language, and they lost that ability, and they were dispersed, around the planet then in multiple languages for the folly of their hubris and their pride. And in a certain way, I think that's very characteristic of the human animal, where we have, maybe not all of us have felt that we're engaged in these grandiose ventures, but in a certain way we are, because we have become a species that has the challenge of whether we will be the engineers of our own destruction. And so no matter what energy device we come up with, any future that we can envision, no matter how wonderful, will also be dependent on how we can evolve as humans in how we relate to each other. And while with ITER, you could look at it like a reverse Tower of Babel in the sense of the, maybe math or CAD computing, design computing, becoming our common language that we can reach and ensure that we can make things all over the world that come here and fit together into a single experimental device that will shape our future. The heart of what we're doing is exactly what you have said. The heart of what we are doing is learning how to get along with each other toward a common goal. And in the end, that will, in my view, be an equally important legacy from this project. Can we learn to do that? And then not only learn in the cause of doing something that now I go back home and build my own fusion tokamaks, but can I learn that, wow, that cooperation made us more than the sum of our parts. And in that type of collaboration, we have a chance of answering that question, are we going to be the architects of our own self-destruction, with a no, or answering it in a positive way? Can we in fact collaborate in a way that we recognize that we are united in what we want to pass to our children? And I think the answer will be a resounding yes. So that would be my closure, and that would be my wish that is probably the single most important thing for your listeners to take away. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Laban. It was a pleasure talking to you. It was a huge learning experience for me, and I'm sure it would be the same for our audience. And with that, I thank you and all the people who've been involved in ITER, and goodbye. And I wish you the best of luck in the successful implementation of ITER. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.